Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian.
Hello, everyone.
It is so nice to be back and recording with you.
Yes, it has been a lot of work in getting things organized and just kind of getting thoughts and direction and flow figured. So yeah, it's been quite a bit of work, but you've done a lot of legwork, Courtney.
Yes,
lot.
Sir. But you know what? You got to be there. So we were doing like all these sessions where we had the research and we're laying it out. We're figuring the best way to tell the story and to be true to the voices of the people who lived it. And Dad got to go through the whole process of, man, how do we conquer all this information and make it, digestible and understandable, but also enjoyable, for everyone to listen to. So we are here. We are ready. Let's do it.
We are very ready. We have a lot to share, and so we're going to start with the feedback that we had, or any questions, the things that we discussed last episode that we wanted to make sure that we covered. There was a question, or there's something we touched on, was the coal, and there were questions left unanswered last episode about the amount of coal that was on the Titanic, and that's something we're not going to get into right now, but we will address this in the upcoming crew episode. So this episode is going to, there's going to be specifically looking from the crew's perspective. That will be further down the road, so we will take a look at that then.
Never fear, we didn't forget. No. There will be an answer. It just doesn't fit in this episode.
Yeah, no, it just doesn't fit. And there was also, we had talked about, I was trying to find, I thought I could find a real world example for the 30,000 horsepower, the amount of power that happened when the Titanic went past the New York and it actually drew it towards it, and it was talking about the amount of power that was like. There's really no good definitive real world explanation like I could tell you. Like it's like, if something you could see or that you would experience. So,
and for me, this is so not my world. So I was like, how many F-250s does that equal?
Well, it would be a whole bunch, but let's just put it this way. The displacement of the New York was 17,270 tons. That's a lot of weight. And that the movement of the Titanic through the water, that amount of power that it was, the propellers were putting into the water, it created that suction as it went past it, and it just drew that much weight within 4 feet? I think it was within 4 feet.
Well, when they finally pulled them apart, or when they narrowly avoided disaster, they were about 4 feet apart. Because remember that there was a crew member who said that he could have tossed a penny from Titanic's deck onto the New York's deck. Yeah,
well, I saw an article. I was looking at Wikipedia, and it said the New York, and it had in parenthesis, nearly hit the Titanic. So.
Yeah.
So there really is no good way to come up with that, but horsepower is measured in so many different ways. So anyway, let's just leave it at that, and onto the term poop deck. We talked about that.
I cannot wait to see if he can get through. Oh, no, he's already giggling.
I know, I'm giggling. So the term poop deck comes from the French word la poupe, which means the stern. So poop deck refers to the stern deck. So there's going to be a partial deck above the ship's main after deck, and it's a flat surface on the raised structure at the end of the ship. And I believe you said that this was on our diagram, is it, or the picture?
If you look at the picture of the ship, it makes so much more sense, because if you think about that one long continuous deck, which would be shelter deck C, and then looking at the stern end of the ship, you're going to notice there's just this one random little deck at the very back. It's like, what's that? That's the poop deck.
And it's probably a very good reason why it's sticking way out there, way in the back, all by itself.
Probably. I'm really proud of you that you made it through that.
Yes, I'm sorry.
To be fair, Le Poupe is spelled Poupe for anybody curious. So
Poupe?
Poupe. All right, so the plan for today's episode. As we discussed in length last episode, we are separating out the passenger's story from the crew's. So today we begin our exploration of the Titanic saga solely from the passenger's perspective, so that we can gain an understanding of what they survived that night. We are going to step into the passenger's shoes, so to speak, and experience this tragedy as closely as we can by dissecting what the passengers saw and heard, what they were told and when, and how this affected the decisions they made in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912. So, Let's go back in time.
Do, 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 do. Sorry, that's the best sound.
Was that Twilight Zone? Was it
Yeah,
Doctor
no,
Who?
I'm sorry.
Like,
Well, I don't.
I'm
Kind
not
of like that was like kind of like Twilight Zone.
oh, okay.
Sorry. Okay.
At some point, you know what? We'll come up with something.
I'll come up with a better. I'll figure out a way to
figure it out.
inject some sound.
All right, so where we left off last episode, Titanic was leaving Ireland and heading out to sea towards New York. We're going to back it up just a little bit. So on the morning of Thursday, April 11th, 1912, the RMS Titanic was making her way from Cherbourg, France, to Queenstown, Ireland. Now, I did want to toss this in right here. Titanic is often referred to as the SS Titanic or even the HMS Titanic. In actuality, she is the RMS Titanic, which stands for Royal Mail Ship.
Mail, as in male or female or?
MAIL.
Oh,
Packages,
MAIL.
letters.
Oh, so they were
Yes.
bringing mail.
Yes. So Bruce Ismay testified at the United States Senate inquiry that the White Star Line held a contract with the British government to transport mail between Southampton, England, and New York. The compensation for doing so was £70,000 a year in 1912.
Wow.
So roughly $2.2 million in today's U.S. currency.
Wow, that was quite a contract for them, and that's a lot of that would have been a lot of money back then. So, well, knowing that Queenstown was Titanic's last port of call before heading across the Atlantic, many passengers took the opportunity to pop one last letter into the mail bags that were being carried ashore. So, as a first-class passenger, Arthur G. wrote this to his family shortly after the Titanic left Southampton, England. Quote, "In the language of the poet, this is a knockout. I have never seen anything so magnificent, even in a first-class hotel. I might be living in a palace. We seem to be miles above the water, and there are certainly miles of promenade deck. The lobbies are so long they appear to come to a point in the distance. Just finished dinner. They call us up to dress by bugle. Such a dinner! Exclamation mark. My gracious, another exclamation. So,
like, we're talking triple exclamation marks.
Yeah, so he's, called by bugle. That'd be kind of cool.
Well, also, I was thinking about coming to a point in the distance. Like, I very rarely am anywhere that's that large.
No.
You know?
So, I can only imagine how palatial and how just beautiful it must have been. And second-class passenger Juliette LaRoche sent a letter to her father describing how comfortable and pleasant the voyage had been so far. Quote, "I have just been told that we are going to stop in a moment, so I take this opportunity to drop you a few lines and tell you about us. The arrangements could not be more comfortable. We have 2 bunks in our cabin, and the 2 babies sleep on a sofa that converts into a bed. At the moment, they are strolling on the enclosed deck with Joseph. Louise is in her pram, and Simone is pushing her."
I thought this was such a sweet little story.
If you could see how big this ship is, one could hardly find the way back to one's cabin in the number of corridors. And then there was third-class passenger Elizabeth Johnson. She sent a postcard to her father that read, quote, "We are just arriving at Queenstown. We are all feeling A1. The kids are skipping about like skylarks." Wow. So it's... that was what a wonderful experience it must have been for them. Just a beautiful, beautiful.
And if you think
palatial.
about it, today we have text and email and whatnot. You send off a quick message when you're getting ready to take off on an airplane. Turning off my phone, going in airplane mode. For them, it was writing a quick letter, pop it in the bag. It's going to go ashore. They're getting ready to be out at sea for 4 or 5 days. Obviously, there's no way to contact anybody during that time, except for by wireless. You could actually, on Titanic, send a wireless message on, it's called a Marconi wireless, but it was very new. It was really more of a novelty than anything. So, and for the third class, they're probably not going to spend their money on that. So they're like, oh, just going to send one last thing out.
It's amazing how well that, mail has worked well for many, many centuries, or at least 1900, even back. I was looking at some of these shows we've been watching back in the 1800s, and they're talking about sending a letter. I'm like, how in the world they do that?
Did you just see? I know this is totally an aside, but did you see the thing in the news lately that there was a letter from World War I that just got delivered last week, and so it was from somebody on the front lines. and they wrote it home, and this is in England, and and then they wrote the letter. It gets delivered to the current residents, and they were like, So they went to the local mail office or whatnot, and they were like, how did this even happen? They're like, well, got lost in a corner for 100 years.
Wow.
So anyway, total side note.
Oh yeah, no, but it's just amazing that they were taking mail passengers. You know, just the fact of that happening. You know, mail being around the world. I mean, passenger liners and that at that point in time, you know, not with the technology, they didn't have what we have. So such a different world. There's a note you had about the third class passengers. What was that?
So I just wanted to point this out because we're going to get into this a little bit more. But when you're reading through a lot of the letters, the first and second class have a tendency to write very prolifically. They're a lot longer. They're a lot more descriptive. The third class really don't. It's more kind of these, I will, we're going to be arriving X day. I'll meet you here. It's more business kind of focused. It's
Kinda
not
just
as
more
descriptive.
short, concise, to the point.
Exactly. So we actually don't hear a whole lot of things from the third class, which is why we wanted to make sure to include that little statement, such as it is, just so that we could we could hear from some of them.
Okay.
So it's about 11:30 Thursday morning. Titanic dropped anchor a few miles off Ireland's coast, and 2 tenders from the Queenstown wharf began the process of transferring mail and passengers. More than mail was leaving Titanic at this point in her journey. 7 first-class passengers disembarked at Queenstown, including Father Francis Brown. If you remember from our methodology episode, Father Brown was responsible for capturing some of the only surviving photographs of Titanic. He took dozens of pictures, many of which attempted to convey the sheer magnitude of the ship. There's one where he's like hanging over the side practically, just trying to get a shot down the side of the ship.
Oh, very cool.
Others were a lot more personal. One of my favorites is a man and a young boy that are playing deck games in the sunshine. And another shows the Marconi wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, taking a smoke break on the boat deck. So although Brown didn't know it at the time, the film he was carrying ashore contained the last known images of many crew members and passengers.
Wow, that's true. If he was allowed, he would have been, he disembarked.
Well, wait till you hear this. As Father Brown walked down the gangway toward one of the tenders that would ferry him to shore, he said goodbye to the nearby crew, saying, I will give you copies of my photos when you come again. Pleasant voyage.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. Of course, Titanic would never return to Queenstown ever again, and much of the White Star Line crew did not survive the voyage.
Oh, my goodness. So,
if you would like to see those images for yourself, we actually have a link. It will be on our sources page on the website, theprimarynerd.com. And if you follow the link, it'll take you to just a beautiful array of his photos.
Oh, very cool. Excellent. So, also disembarking in Queenstown was an unnamed newspaper correspondent who later published the following description of his brief time aboard the Ship of Dreams. He stated, deck over deck and apartment after apartment let their deceitful aid to persuade us that instead of being on the sea, we were still on terra firma. Lifts and lounges and libraries are not generally associated in the public mind with second class, yet in the Titanic are all found. On the crowded third-class deck were hundreds of English, Dutch, Italian, and French mingling in happy fellowship, and when we wandered down among them, we found that for them, too, the Titanic was a wonder. No more general cabins, but hundreds of comfortable rooms with 2, 4, or 6 berths each, beautifully covered in red and white coverlets. Here, too, are lounges and smoking rooms, less magnificent than those amidship, to be sure, but none the less comfortable, and which, with the swivel chairs and separate tables in the dining rooms, struck me as not quite fitting in with my previous notion of steerage accommodations. So that was that must have been quite.
It made an impression.
It made that the people that were in the third class, their accommodations were so nice, so upscale compared to what they'd seen. I mean, steerage.
I remember reading, and again, remember they didn't even refer to them as steerage on Titanic. They were third class, but it was so commonplace to refer to, those poorer people as steerage. I read something that the third class got, ice cream on Titanic.
Oh,
And
wow.
these are people that have worked probably every day of their lives. They probably don't get very many luxuries. And the White Star Line really did set an incredibly high bar.
Oh, that's, I mean, for them, that must have been what an experience.
Oh, amazing.
So, for those who disembarked Titanic on Thursday morning, their journey was at an end. However, there were far more passengers that boarded Titanic in Queenstown than had left her, 123 new people to be exact. And out of that number, 113 were third-class passengers.
So by 1:30 in the afternoon on Thursday, the process of transferring passengers, cargo, and mail was complete. So Titanic raised her anchor, made her way out to the open sea. Her powerful engines were unleashed at the captain's command full ahead, and so Titanic's first transatlantic voyage had begun. But New York Harbor was more than 2,000 miles away, so the passengers settled in to enjoy the remaining days of the voyage. Soon they fell into a comfortable, uneventful routine that lasted from Thursday, April 11th through Saturday, April the 13th. So, just taking a moment, pause for a quick second. The previous 2 episodes that we have done about Titanic have laid the groundwork for this one. However, moving forward, the narrative will be driven primarily by the voices of the passengers that were on Titanic. If you recall from our methodology episode, the goal of the primary nerd is to explore history by discussing the experiences and observations of historical persons through the lens of first-hand accounts. The quotes we're going to share with you are the passengers' actual words. There has been no editorializing on our part. As we tell you the Titanic's story through the eyes of its passengers, you'll notice that the quotes are derived mainly from first and second class passengers. There are a couple reasons for this. Number 1, based on the primary sources, it appears that the first and second class passengers had very similar experiences, and I am talking specifically when we get into the collision and the aftermath. So the first and second class passengers had very similar experiences with little to no distinction based on class. Therefore, combining their stories fills in certain gaps in the overall narrative when it comes to those hours of her sinking. Number 2, according to the U.S. Senate Titanic inquiry, there were 710 third-class men, women, and children on board. Out of that number, 536 of them died.
Wow.
This means there was only 174 third-class passengers to even leave a record or write anything. That's 25%.
Wow.
And then this incredibly small percentage of third-class survivors generally did not publish memoirs or get interviewed by newspapers. Even their letters home are very short and lacking in detail, which goes back to what we were just talking about. With the third class, they wrote what they needed to, and they let that be that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they didn't get flowery. You know, the first class and the second class, they are publishing all over the place. Like, they made sure everybody knew. So, well, I find it particularly shocking that only 2 third-class passengers were interviewed during the U.S. Senate Titanic inquiry. 2. However, that is 2 more than were interviewed during the British inquiry. That's right, a whopping 0 third-class passengers were questioned during the whole of the investigation in Britain.
Wow.
And yet, both inquiries found that there was, quote, no distinction between passengers based on class. But we'll get into that later.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
No. Fear not. The voices of the third-class passengers will be heard, and in fact, we will be giving them their own in-depth analysis, but our methodology for doing so is going to be a little bit different than first and second class. So, what you're hearing, it's going to be first and second, and then we're going to do a whole thing on the third.
Okay. Very good. So with that being said, let's listen to the first and second class passengers as they describe their initial days at sea. So first class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon reminisced, the first days of the crossing were uneventful. Like everyone else, I was entranced with the beauty of the liner. I had never dreamt of traveling in such luxury. I remember being childishly pleased on finding strawberries on my breakfast table, fancy strawberries in April and in mid-ocean. The whole thing is positively uncanny. I kept saying to my husband, why you would think we were at the Ritz. Wow. And the unofficial daily schedule that many passengers followed was laid out by first-class passenger Margaret Brown, who recorded, half after 12, found most of the passengers promenading the deck or basking in the warm sun outside the Palm Garden. After luncheon, the favorite and popular place was the reading room, where the passengers settled themselves comfortably with some chosen book from the well-equipped library on the ship. Small groups were standing here and there, discussing the ship and its marvels, its possibility for speed, and all its wonderful advantages over anything of its kind heretofore put afloat. Thus, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday were passed. And then in his memoirs, first-class passenger Jack Thayer later wrote, "The weather was fair and clear, the ship palatial, the food delicious. I occupied a stateroom adjoining that of my father and mother on sea deck, and needless to say, being 17 years old, I was all over the ship. There are a great many prominent people on the passenger list, and because it was her maiden voyage, there were on board many of those responsible for the building of the ship and the management of the steamship line, all of whom were often with my father and myself during the few days we were aboard the ship."
Of those on board who were involved in the building and or management of Titanic, the two most notable names were Bruce Ismay and Thomas Andrews. Bruce Ismay, you may recall from our first Titanic episode, was the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line. He was traveling as a first-class passenger, but as you read through the passenger testimony, it's often difficult to tell whether he was on board Titanic primarily for business or pleasure. Thomas Andrews was the managing director of Harland and Wolff Shipbuilders out of Belfast, Ireland, but more importantly, he was the main designer of both Titanic and Olympic. And, side note, Thomas Andrews is the nephew of Lord Pirret, who we discussed in our first Titanic episode.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Very cool.
The wine guy.
Oh,
This is his nephew.
Oh,
yeah.
wow. It's a family affair.
It is. It is a family affair. And Thomas Andrews, though, I want to give him all the credit he is due. He was most definitely on board for business purposes. He was a notoriously hard worker as well as a brilliant designer. He spent most of the voyage inspecting every nook and cranny of the ship and keeping meticulous notes on possible improvements for future White Star Line vessels. But he still made appearances at meals and certain social gatherings. We know this because passengers wrote down snippets of conversation they had with him wherein details of the ship were discussed. One of these details was the fact that Titanic was not fully completed by the time she set sail on Wednesday, April the 10th.
Wow. Not done.
Not done. According to first-class passenger Eleanor K. Spear, quote, "Aboard the Titanic, I sat at the same table with the ship's surgeon and Thomas Andrews, who is said to have designed the Titanic. A fact not generally known is that the Titanic was not ready to sail at the time she did. Mr. Andrews told me himself and said that the only reason they allowed her to go when they did was that the sailing date had already been fixed. They just simply had to start. While the ship was fitted up most sumptuously, one could not help but notice she was not prepared to sail. There were none of the usual printed notices in the cabins. The frames for them were on the walls, but the notices themselves were not there."
So, when they say it wasn't ready for sale, I mean, of course she was seaworthy. Of course,
They had done the trials.
Right.
All of the I's had been dotted, the T's had been crossed, the bureaucracy had been satisfied.
Right. But having everything in place. I mean, these notices in the cabins, those probably would have told them where to go in case of emergency, possibly, or lifeboats to go to, or information they would have needed for possibly the trip and or any kind of it's hard to say.
Well,
but
if you think about now, if you travel on an airplane, they've got all those not the brochures, but you know what I'm talking about, the safety guidelines in the back.
Right.
I'm assuming it was something to that effect, but like notices, it is an interesting. It's an interesting moment.
I do find, especially as beautiful and as palatial and all. I just, in my mind, I just picture it being 100% done.
Oh, there was still wet paint. So in the movie where she's older and she's like, the sheets have never been slept on, I can still smell the fresh paint. That is real. There was really freshly painted things, and so they were putting a bunch of flowers on board, which I'm sure they had already chosen to do flowers just for beauty purposes. But they also said that they tried to bring in the fresh flowers to disguise the smell of the wet paint.
Oh, wow. So other passengers also noted certain unfinished aspects of Titanic, such as first-class passenger May Futrell said, "On the second day, Jacques and I went over the whole ship. I had heard from someone that the Titanic had been put to sea unfinished. I noticed that the Parisian cafe men were fitting doors." So they're actually doing some physical...
I mean, that's construction,
That's construction going on. So, and then second-class passenger Yeah, Amanita Shelley recalled, in the ladies' toilet room, only part of the fixtures had been installed. Some of the said fixtures being still in crates. So here you have a bathroom that's not even finished. So, and then a particularly interesting statement came from first-class passenger Daisy Minahan, who gave the following deposition during the U.S. Senate Titanic inquiry. Quote, "A stewardess told me that after the Titanic left Southampton, there were a number of carpenters working to put the doors of the airtight compartments in working order. They had great difficulty in making them respond, and one of them remarked that they would be of little use in case of accident because it took so long to make them work." I mean, the watertight
I mean, she calls them the airtight
well,
compartments.
it would have been the
It
watertight.
would have been the watertight
Yes,
compartments.
yes.
So that thing that, hitting that switch and it's just going to
Yep.
automatically make the ship safe, quote unquote, all of that information that's been put out there in the magazines, in the newspapers. They can't get the doors to respond.
Wow.
Like, it's a problem.
Yes, that could very well be a problem. So, yeah.
Ooh. So, in addition to Titanic not being fully completed, passengers also describe a lack of organization and cohesiveness among the crew members. Let's hear again from second class passenger. I'm going to be real with you. I do not know how to pronounce her name. It is spelled Imanita.
Imanita?
Imanita? We're going with Imanita. So, second class passenger, Imanita Shelley. She said, although the servants on board were most willing, they had a hard time to do their work. The stewardesses could not even get a tray to serve my meals and had to bring the plate and dishes one at a time in her hands, making the service very slow and annoying. The food, though good and plentiful, was ruined by this trouble in serving. Although both the stewards and stewardesses appealed time and time again to the heads of their departments, no relief was obtained. There seemed to be no organization at all.
Oh, wow.
And then first-class passenger Norman Chambers later jotted down his observations about the crew. He said, a large percentage of the steward part of the crew were new. My own room steward complained to me on the second day out that he did not know where anything was on the ship and that no one would tell him.
Oh, no.
Wait, what?
Wow, yeah, go find it.
Jeez.
Google it.
Google it, right? Way
Wow.
before Google was invented.
Oh, yeah.
Other passengers noticed issues among the crew that went beyond a lack of organization into a failure to adhere to protocol.
Oh, no.
First-class passenger Mihaela Douglas made the following affidavit for the U.S. Senate Titanic inquiry. She said, on Titanic, as Mr. Douglas and I were walking forward, we saw a seaman taking the temperature of the water. The deck seemed so high above the sea that I was interested to know if the tiny pail could reach it. There was quite a breeze, and although the pail was weighted, it did not. This I watched from the open window of the covered deck, so I'm thinking she's probably on the promenade deck. Drawing up the pail, the seaman filled it with water from the stand pipe, placed a thermometer in it, and went off with it to the officer in charge. I called the attention of my husband to this fact, but he belittled it and told me it would not be necessary to tell the ship's officer of the incident. So
they're not taking ocean water to check the temperature.
This kind of blows my mind because this is actually something that I had read about during the U.S. Senate Titanic inquiry. This got brought up because it was part of their protocol that they were supposed to be taking the temperature of the seawater. I think it was every 2 hours. Don't quote me. At prescribed times, they were supposed to be taking the temperature of the water. The purpose of which was to see, are we at a level that we can expect ice? So there is a purpose for this.
Oh, sure. Had to be.
And when they were asked, were these tests done? And the officer, I believe it's Light Toller, said, well, yes, of course they would have been done. They're like, well, are you sure? Would your person have reported to you if they hadn't done it? Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then you've got this passenger who's saying, it sounds, okay, she says the pail cannot reach the water. So there's no seawater. So they go to a standpipe. One would assume they mean like a spigot or a faucet that's actually on the ship.
Yeah, there's water. It's water coming from the ship is
Right.
what it is. It's
So then
not-
putting the thermometer
right.
in it, of course it's not going to be at freezing levels. And then he goes off to go report to an officer. It's like, oh my God, it's so frustrating.
Well, there's a reason why that the processes and procedures are put in place. There's a reason why, and when people don't follow them, that and it just shows a lack of just going with the new crew, not
Yes.
helping one another, not organized. It's just
There's a lack of care. There's a lack of accountability.
Well, just a lack of cohesiveness and a lack of just there was the not accountability, but them following through and being basically they're like supposed to be like a first class or first rate
Yeah.
team. They weren't. So
So Wrapping up this section. All the primary sources from the passengers agree that the first few days aboard Titanic were uneventful and very pleasant. There were a few oddities. Aspects of the ship were clearly not finished, and the crew was not fully acquainted with either the ship or each other. But there was nothing so troublesome as to detract from the passengers' enjoyment of the voyage, and certainly nothing that hinted towards the imminent disaster.
Yeah, so that brings us up to Sunday, April 14th, 1912, and this is the morning of the day of the collision. So all accounts agree that Sunday was a beautiful, albeit extremely cold day. So after the Sunday church services were concluded, first-class passenger Margaret Brown remembered that some passengers went outside to promenade on deck, but much more briskly as the temperature had dropped perceptibly lower. So a quick drop it was getting cold fast. So, and then first-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon wrote in her autobiography, "The day of the disaster dawned calm and bright. The sea was exceptionally still. But as the day wore on, the cold increased, and as we walked around the deck, I shivered in my furs. I have never felt so cold," I said to Cosmo. "Surely it must be icebergs about." He made fun of my ignorance, and Captain Smith, who happened to be passing, assured me that we were right away from the ice zone.
So I just got to say, every time I see Cosmo, I think Cosmo and Wanda from the
I thought so.
I can't.
Fairly Odd Parent. Yeah,
I can't help it.
Yeah, I know. I thought the same thing.
Okay.
So we just experienced some very cold temperatures here, and that was
my pipes burst. So
yeah,
I remember that well.
So that's pretty darn cold. So. But this was no means the last time the topic of ice would be discussed that day. So as first-class passenger Helen Otsby remembered, quote, "Late Sunday morning, as I was sitting on deck, Captain Smith was talking nearby to a few passengers when a steward came out and handed him a message. Captain Smith looked at it, but then continued talking for a while with the passengers. I have always felt this might have been one of the several messages received that day, warning of ice ahead." So, I mean, that's...
She's looking back, but you're also like, there's a good chance.
There could have been, but there was a statement also from first-class passenger Mahala Douglas, and she gave this to the U.S. Senate Titanic inquiry. She said, "We heard many stories of the rescue from many sources. Among them, I will quote Mrs. Ryerson of Philadelphia." And Mrs. Ryerson, so this is Mrs. Ryerson speaking, being quoted by Mahala Douglas.
Yes.
"Sunday afternoon, Mr. Ismay, whom I know very slightly, passed me on the deck. He showed me in his brusque manner a marconigram saying, 'We have just had news that we are in the icebergs.' 'Of course you'll slow down,' I said. 'Oh, no,' he replied. 'We will put on more boilers and get out of it.'"
So just to clarify, the quote is given by Mahala Douglas, but she is repeating a conversation that she had with Emily Ryerson, who in turn was repeating a conversation she allegedly had with Bruce Ismay. This is a take it with a grain of salt situation for sure.
Oh, sure.
But interestingly, second-class passenger Emanita Shelley made a comment that's almost identical to the alleged Emily Ryerson quote. But Mrs. Shelley said it was Captain Smith who vocalized the decision to increase speed. So Mrs. Shelley said, quote, In the early evening of the night of the accident, the temperature had fallen considerably so that all on board realized we were in the ice belt. There were rumors of wireless messages from other ships warning of icebergs close at hand. It was also reported that certain first-class passengers had asked if the ship was to slow down whilst going through the ice belts and had been told by the captain that on the contrary, the ship would be speeded through.
Interesting. So here you have one person say Captain Smith, one person say Mr. Ismay. So that's interesting.
Now, I do want to point out these two situations are not mutually exclusive. Both Captain Smith and Bruce Ismay could very well have been passing along the same information because they both knew the same information. However, if that is true, that would imply that Ismay was far more involved in the navigation discussion and possibly decisions at this point in the voyage than he later insisted to investigators.
Interesting.
But what if Mrs. Shelley was just re-quoting the Emily Ryerson quote, but is just messing up who said it?
No, that's true. I mean, that could very well be. Though, well, just interesting that but these were statements that were made. So we're just putting it out there for talking about it and let our listeners just know what was said, and you can make up because there are different ways you could look at it. So it is It's information that I find very interesting. So
It is, and the fact that both Mrs. Shelley and the Haley Douglas, they're on the record. This was not casually said to a newspaper. This is in the U.S. Senate inquiry.
yes. Anyway, Mahala Douglas is not the only passenger that connects Mr. Ismay with the ice warnings received by Titanic throughout Sunday, April 14th. First-class passenger Jack Thayer wrote in his memoirs, "It became noticeably colder as the afternoon wore on. I remember Mr. Ismay showing us a wire regarding the presence of ice and remarking that we would not reach that position until around 9 p.m." So,
Going back to our methodology episode, a question to ask when reading a primary source such as this one is, did the writer personally witness the event in question, or does the writer have knowledge, expertise, or access to privileged information which allows them to testify on the topic both confidently and accurately? The answer to both in this instance is yes.
yes. I mean, he said Mr. Is showed him a wire and told them where they would reach the ice position by 9 p.m. So, yes, he was there. He was a source for that information. So we are still on Sunday, April 14th, 1912, the day of the collision. But we are in the evening, and it is 6 p.m. in the evening. The bugle sounded to alert the passengers that it was time to dress for dinner.
I think we should start instituting this at our
That
house.
would be so cool. A bugle?
Yes. I'm telling you right now, I'm going to find a way that whenever we all get together as a family, I will find like a bugle app or something on my phone, and we're going to play it.
Well, we have that dinner coming up. Do it.
I'm telling you.
Do it. That'd be way cool. So it was so cold that some passengers chose not to dress for dinner, instead choosing to wear thicker articles of clothing. Unlike the second and third class, the first class passengers were not restricted to their assigned dining saloons for meals. They had a plethora of options, including the Veranda and Palm Court cafes, the Café Parisien, and the a la carte first class restaurant. The dining experience in the a la carte first class restaurant was not included in the cost of the first class ticket, but it offered a more intimate dining experience than the first class dining saloon.
I'm sorry, wouldn't that tick you off if you're spending $133,000 or whatever it was?
Well, maybe for them it was. Remember, that was a very small percentage
and it was like the one with the special promenade. But still, okay, I'm sorry. If I'm spending that much, y'all can afford to give me some food.
Yeah, well, I think that's why people do cruises. And everyone who tells me now, hey, I love a cruise, it's like, why? I love the food.
The food.
You can eat 24 hours a day.
It's midnight, you can get French onion soup at midnight.
Someday I hope to experience that.
Yeah,
so
super cool.
Anyway, so the White Star Line adopted the a la carte dining concept from the Hamburg America Line, a German passenger steamship line, which had installed Ritz-Carlton restaurants in their vessels. Wow. Mm-hmm. Although Titanic's a la carte restaurant was not affiliated with the Ritz-Carlton, some of the passengers who had previously traveled on the Hamburg America Line still referred to it as the Ritz restaurant. A Ritz restaurant.
Like out of London. The
Wow.
Ritz, yeah.
Wow. Amazing. Staff of the a la carte restaurant were mostly Italian and French and had been recruited from London's most prestigious restaurants. They were not considered part of the White Star Line crew and instead functioned as a completely separate entity.
There was a dinner party being held in honor of Captain Smith in the a la carte restaurant, which was hosted by George and Eleanor Widener. The guest list was comprised of very socially prominent, very wealthy passengers. Interestingly, Bruce Ismay was not invited to join the select group, although he too was dining in the a la carte restaurant that evening. Oh. Later, the survivors present at this party, both passengers and the crew that were serving them, would be questioned intensely about the social gathering, particularly Captain Smith's behavior and if he had partaken in any alcohol.
Oh, good question.
I mean, you got to start looking into stuff like that. Also dining in the a la carte restaurant was first-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon, who recorded, "I remembered that last meal on the Titanic very well. Everyone was very gay, and at the neighboring tables, people were making bets on the probable time of this record-breaking run. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, was dining with the ship's doctor next to our table, and I remember that several men appealed to him as to how much longer we would be at sea. Mr. Ismay was most confident and said that undoubtedly the ship would establish a record."
Wow. So looking fast. They want to break some records and betting on speed in an iceberg field. Yeah, that's not a good idea.
First class passenger May Futrell remembered that evening very fondly in her later writings. She said, quote, "It was a brilliant crowd. Jewels flashed from the gowns of the women, and oh, the dear women, how fondly they wore their latest Parisian gowns. It was the first time that most of them had an opportunity to display their newly acquired finery. The soft, sweet odors of rare flowers pervaded the atmosphere. The orchestra played popular music. It was buoyant. Oh, such a jolly crowd. It was a rare gathering of beautiful women and splendid men."
Wow.
The passengers' recollections of Sunday evening are unequivocally positive. It seems that the Titanic kitchen staff, I'll say that 5 times fast, put their best foot forward for all 3 classes on board. Second class passenger Charlotte Collier wrote, "At dinner time, I was at my place in the saloon. No effort had been spared to serve even to the second cabin passengers on that Sunday the best dinner that money could buy."
Sounds like they took good care of all their classes of passengers.
Yeah, and then third class passenger Daniel Buckley said, "We had a grand time on Titanic. We got very good diet, and we had a very jolly time dancing and singing. We had every kind of an instrument on board to amuse us," which I'd like to point out, the third class party in the movie Titanic, where Rose goes down with Jack, that is real.
That's real,
There was
huh?
1,000% like a third class soiree going on down there. Apparently they had a couple different pianos in their general room, but they had an earlier curfew. They made them go to bed earlier than first and second class. I know, it's just so lame.
So is there in any of the in the information you found that from, was there any mention of Jack or Rose?
Yeah. Although I will tell you, it's my personal opinion that I think that May Futrell, that we've heard from a couple times, I think that certain of her actions inspired the writing of Rose in the Titanic movie. But that's my opinion.
Just an opinion? Very good. So it is well documented that Sunday evening became colder and colder, leading most of the passengers to wrap up the evening's festivities early due to the biting cold. As the passengers returned to their staterooms, many described an increase in the ship's vibration, which they assumed was due to an increase in engine speed. So according to first-class passenger May Futrell, "There was a death chill in the air which sent a shudder through me and caused me to hurry back into the cheer and warmth of the cabin. The terrible chilliness affected all alike, and a number of the men commented that we were in close vicinity of icebergs. No one had the slightest fear, however, for Mr. Andrews, who had some part in the construction of the vessel, he called it his baby, had laughingly assured us that at last man had constructed an unsinkable craft."
I mean, I think it's precious that he refers to Titanic as his baby.
Well, after the work he put in, I can certainly understand that. And then first-class passenger Mahala Douglas remembered, "On Sunday, we had a delightful day, everyone in the best of spirits. The time the boat was making was considered very good, and all were interested in getting into New York early. As we went to our stateroom, we both remarked that the boat was going faster than she had ever had. The vibration as one passed the stairway in the center was very noticeable." And then first-class passenger Jack Thayer stated, "It had become very much colder. It was a brilliant starry night. A very light haze, hardly noticeable, hung low over the water. We were steaming along at 22 or 23 knots, not reducing speed at all, in spite of the many warnings of the presence of ice which had come in from other ships during the afternoon and evening. We were out of a record run." So
out for a record run.
Out for a record run. Okay. So I wonder if he knew about the 22 or 23, if that was just something that he was told or...
But keep in mind, they were posting the previous days, how many miles they'd traveled, how fast they were going.
Okay.
I mean, this was a very much a topic of conversation, and people were making bets on it, So perhaps this was actually known. Now, I do think it's interesting. It's an interesting moment in his story. Is this an opinion that he formed later, that they were out for a record run? Did Ismay say that specifically to him and his father? Because remember, this is Jack who was saying he was with Ismay. Ismay showed him and his father the ice message.
Well, they're just previous a few quotes back. They were talking about the speed of the ship and making about did they say bets or did they say
they were making the bets and they were asking Ismay in the restaurant, but and Jack wasn't there. His parents were in the a la carte restaurant, but Jack was in the first class dining saloon. He had to actually eat on his own that night. So, again, it's one of those interesting moments because Jack Thayer wrote these memoirs many years in the future. So he's looking back on this experience from the benefit of hindsight.
Well, I mean, there had to have been some discussion or some talk of this because this information is there.
Yes.
There had to have been something. There had to have been something
Right.
said. There had to have been some people speaking or they're catching conversations or whatever. So, but yeah, record run. Well, it was a maiden voyage, and it was supposed to be bigger, better, faster, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
That is true. The drastic drop in temperature was a topic of conversation between some of the passengers and the stewardesses that cared for them. In a letter to her mother, first-class passenger Gladys Cherry later wrote, "Sunday night on the Titanic, it got very, very cold, icy. And I asked the steward why it was so cold. He said it was icebergs, but we did not slow down at all, and we were going 22 knots." After a second-class passenger, Charlotte Collier, said, "After I had eaten, I listened to the orchestra for a while. I went to my cabin and had just climbed into my berth when a stewardess came in. 'Do you know where we are?' she said pleasantly. 'We are what is called the Devil's Hole.'" Which, can you imagine being told this by someone?
Oh my goodness.
"What does that mean?" I asked her. "That it is a dangerous part of the ocean," she answered. "Many accidents have happened near here. They say that icebergs drift down as far as this. It's getting to be very cold on deck, so perhaps there's ice around us now." She left the cabin, and soon I dropped off to sleep. Her talk about icebergs had not frightened me, but it shows that the crew were awake to the danger. As far as I can tell, we had not slackened our speed in the least.
Oh wow.
So that was a great point, is that people are aware. This is not totally coming out of left field,
Right.
And so there's been talk of ice all day that we've talked about. Starting in the morning, people are talking about ice.
Right.
The ice fields, the ice messages, the ice belts. This is, the stewardesses are talking about it. They're aware. So, wrapping up, it is Sunday night, April 14th, 1912. The Titanic is in the North Atlantic, and although she is still about 400 miles away from New York, the ship is making such excellent time that it's rumored Titanic will arrive a day earlier than expected. The passengers, regardless of class, have enjoyed a memorable evening, but have turned in early because their cabins are far warmer than the larger public rooms.
Oh, that is an excellent lead up until Sunday, April 14th, 1912, when the collision occurs. So we are up to that point.
We are here.
We are here, but we are going to have to catch that. We're going to start. We'll cover that in our next episode.
Yes. We
will have to sign off for tonight. Well, before we sign off, though, I just want to remind everyone out there that we have email is the primarynerdpodcast@gmail.com. And that comes directly to me. I will respond to all the emails I receive. And our website is theprimarynerd.com. And comments left there go directly to email as well. They'll come right to me.
That's really the best way to get in touch with us, as opposed to trying to do it through Spotify.
Yes, I've gotten some notices from Spotify and from Anchor, and I've gone in and looked, and there's nothing there. So I'm not really quite certain if it's something like just a boilerplate something they send out, or if it's actually someone's trying to communicate with us. I want to communicate if someone is trying to communicate with us through a question and answer, or comment, or suggestions. Yes, we want to respond. So the best way is theprimarynerd.com. A comment there will go to our email, or the email at theprimarynerdpodcast@gmail.com. So we want to hear from you. We love talking about history and the people that their lives and what they experienced. And so, because one day people are going to look back and they're going to say, look at us, and we're going to be the history.
It's a terrifying thought. And never fear, we have everything that are written for the next episode. It's already written. We just need to record it. So you will be getting that next episode a lot faster than these other ones. But we had to get our feet under us so that what we were sharing with you was as thorough and understandable as possible, and being able to not just summarize it. That's the thing. There's plenty of podcasts out there that'll summarize a historical event. We really want to gain an understanding. We want to, get in there and figure it out. So that's what we're trying to bring.
Well, I'm impressed with the amount of information that you had that we've got. Yeah, I was shocked to see how much.
to be really honest, guys, what we're talking about is such a drop in the bucket compared to what I have in my notes. Holy cow.
Yeah.
So I actually did have a thought that with everything, I could very easily publish after this.
You probably could. I mean, there is. We have spent a lot of time together going through this. I've learned so much that I did not know about the Titanic, the people, because of your research and me going over the quotes and us talking about what happened, and even more. We're still in the process of flushing some things out.
Oh yeah, well, because there's some periods that we're getting up in the story where it is just simply a mysterious point in the timeline, you know, and it's a matter of all these historians. We can look at it all day long, but it's just a confusing time. So it's trying to take and create and look at all of this chaos and remain true to what happened, but try to shed some light on it.
Yes, the human perspective.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, with that said, we'll do our sign off. So,
I'm Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd.